I had this really strange moment on the way into the studio this morning.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's one of those gray, blustery days out there. Nothing severe, no weather warnings or anything, but just active.
Right, just a bit of a breeze.
Exactly. But I was reaching for the heavy metal door to the building, and just as I unlatched it, a gust caught the edge.
Oh, I hate that.
It yanked the handle right out of my grip.
Uh-huh.
And it wasn't just a push, it felt aggressive. For a split second, I had this visceral feeling that there was something standing in the doorway that just didn't want me to come inside.
It's unnerving, isn't it? We walk around thinking the space between us and the buildings, or, us and the trees, is completely empty.
Yeah.
We think of it as a void. But that moment with the door reminds you that the void actually has mass. It has velocity.
It definitely had mass today,
And if you spend enough time thinking about it, it almost seems to have a mood.
which is exactly the rabbit hole we are going down today. We are doing a deep dive into the invisible force, the wind.
It's a fantastic topic.
It really is. Yeah. But we aren't just talking about it in terms of high-pressure systems and isobars. We're diving into Marq de Villiers' book, Windswept, the story of wind and weather.
A brilliant book.
It completely dismantled my understanding of what I'm looking at when I look out the window. He argues that wind isn't just a byproduct of planetary physics. It's a character.
Right.
It's a historical figure. And sometimes, quite frankly, it's a monster.
Monster's a strong word, but I think de Villiers would probably agree with you there. He does this wonderful job of framing the duality of the wind right from the start.
How so?
Well, we have this very romanticized pastoral idea of the breeze, right? The caress.
Sure, the gentle wind on a hot day.
Exactly, the gentle zephyr that cools you down on a front porch in July. That's the wind that makes life on Earth tolerable. It circulates heat, it moves seeds around.
Hours the water cycle?
Right, but then you turn the dial just a tiny bit. Add a little more heat to the ocean, a little more rotation, and that caress becomes what de Villiers calls a short-tempered and belligerent god.
A belligerent god. That phrase really stuck with me.
Because if you look at the history of human civilization, or even just the biological history of the planet, the wind is the arbiter. It decides who sails and who sinks.
Who eats and who starves.
Exactly. It decides which crops fail. It literally erodes mountains. It writes history. But for those of us living in modern climate-controlled cities, we've largely forgotten that.
We're insulated.
Completely. We've insulated ourselves from the gods.
We really have. I mean, unless it turns my umbrella inside out or knocks over a patio chair, I treat wind as background noise. It's invisible, it's tasteless, it's just, there.
Which is a huge luxury of the modern age. So our mission today for this deep dive is to strip away that insulation.
Let's do it.
We are going to take the double pane glass and the central heating out of the equation and really look at this force. We're going to explore it from 3 distinct angles.
Right, starting with the personality of the wind.
Yes, why it feels so personal and malevolent when it attacks us. Second, the mythology, how humans for thousands of years tried to make sense of this invisible giant.
And finally, the deep science.
The history of the atmosphere itself, the actual theater where this whole drama plays out.
And I want to flag something for you listening right now. Stick around for the second segment, because we are going to trace what might be the most mind-blowing connection I've ever seen in a science book.
Oh, the hurricane story.
Yes, we are going to connect a gentle rainstorm in a remote African desert to a catastrophic hurricane in Florida. It is the ultimate butterfly effect, but it's not theoretical.
It's a fully documented chain of events. It really changes how you look at a weather map. You realize everything is touching everything else.
But let's start where the author starts.
Yeah.
Before Marq de Villiers was writing books about global weather systems, he was just a kid.
Right.
And he wasn't living in a cozy suburb. He was living in a place that used to have a very different and much more ominous name on the map.
Cape Town, South Africa. Or, as the Portuguese sailors originally named it, the Cape of Storms.
Which honestly is a much cooler name. Why did they ever change it?
Public relations, essentially. The Cape of Storms doesn't exactly encourage sailors to stop for supplies, so the colonial powers rebranded it to the Cape of Good Hope.
Marketing.
Pure marketing. But de Villiers points out that the original name was the scientifically accurate one.
Is that just because of the latitude down there, or is there something specific about the geography?
It's a massive collision zone. You have to picture the bottom of the African continent. On the west side, coming up from the Antarctic, you have the Benguela Current.
Okay, so that's cold water.
Deep, freezing cold water, rich in nutrients but icy. Then, sweeping down the east coast from the Indian Ocean, you have the Ogolas Current, and that's warm tropical water.
So you basically have the planetary equivalent of a radiator and a freezer sitting right next to each other.
Precisely. And just southeast of Cape Town, these two massive oceanic conveyor belts smash into each other. You get warm, moist air rising off the Agulhas, and it hits that cold, dense air from the Benguela. The thermodynamics are just chaotic.
It must generate insane storms.
It creates massive pulses of disturbed air, boiling black thunderheads, and winds that can tear the surface right off the sea.
And this is the backdrop for the author's childhood. He tells his origin story that explains why he is so obsessed and terrified of the wind.
It's a very striking story.
He's playing on the lawns of Sea Point on Table Bay. It sounds idyllic at first, spacious grass, the ocean right there. He's a little kid.
And then the physics we just described arrives.
It doesn't just arrive, it assaults him. The language he uses is so telling. He doesn't say the wind pushed her. He says it seized him.
Seized.
It knocked him flat on his face effortlessly. And then there's this one detail that I found absolutely terrifying. Is the thing that nightmares are made of.
The scream.
The scream. He's a child, he's down, he's terrified. Instinct takes over and he opens his mouth to scream for his mother.
But he says the gale snatched his breath away.
Right out of his mouth.
The wind was moving so fast, with such intense pressure, that it stripped the sound waves right out of his throat and blew them out to sea before they could even reach his own ears.
That image of the soundless scream is haunting. It's total impotence. You are screaming your lungs out, but the air itself refuses to carry your message.
And the danger was very real. It wasn't just scary, it was lethal. The wind starts dragging him across the grass.
And the edge of that lawn isn't a soft, sandy beach.
No, it's a stone walkway and then a drop-off into rocks. And these aren't smooth river stones. These are rocks covered in slippery weeds and needle-sharp barnacles. If he goes over, he's likely dead.
He describes sliding toward the edge, clawing at the grass. He actually hits the metal railing with a crack.
That railing was the only thing that stopped him from being tossed into the boiling ocean like a rag doll.
His mother eventually had to crawl to him. Literally crawl on her hands and knees to drag him back to safety.
But that moment defined his entire relationship with the element. He realized then that wind isn't just physics, it felt personal.
It felt malevolent.
Exactly. He writes that wind is perpetual, persistent, present, even in its absence. It felt like it was waiting for him.
That feeling of malevolence, that the wind is out to get you, is something de Villiers says divides us deeply based on our lifestyle today.
The insulation divide.
Right. He says most of us in cities treat weather as an infrastructure problem.
Think about it. If there's a blizzard in the city, what's your first thought?
Traffic is going to be a nightmare.
Or I hope the subway is running. If it rains, you grab a taxi. We have this underlying assumption that someone will fix it.
The plows will come.
The utility company will fix the power lines. We are annoyed, sure, but we don't feel existentially threatened by it.
But if you go out to a farm or a fishing village,
that insulation vanishes completely. The connection becomes visceral. De Villiers shares the story of his grandfather's farm on the arid plains of South Africa.
that's a brutal environment.
It is. When the rains failed, the heat would build and build until the sky turned a bruised purple. They could physically see the wind coming.
He describes it as a wall of violent color, violet and brown, rilling in from the west.
And you didn't call a customer service line. You had maybe an hour. You had to batten the shutters, drag the animals into the barn, cover the wells.
Because when that dust storm hit, it wasn't just windy.
It was an abrasive force. It would strip the fruit right off the trees. It would take the topsoil, your actual livelihood, and turn it into dust.
That's where the personality comes in. It's not just air moving from high pressure to low pressure. It's a thief. It's taking the food out of your mouth.
Exactly. And before we had modern technology, before we had apps that told us exactly when the rain would start, humans had to develop a sensory relationship with that force. We had to feel it coming in our bones.
There is this incredible story in the book about a man named Fred Krause. This is an old-school seaman from Lunenburg.
This is back in 1927. No satellites, no radar, no radio updates. Fred was a young man working on a schooner called the Partana.
They were fishing on the Grand Banks, right?
Yes, which is notoriously dangerous water. But on this specific afternoon, it was beautiful. Light breeze, sun shining. The crew is relaxing on deck, probably thinking about dinner.
But the captain isn't relaxing.
No. The captain is staring at the sunset. And the book doesn't say exactly what he saw. Maybe a specific tint of green in the sky, or a way the clouds were feathering. But his instinct translated that visual data into one word: danger.
So he turns to the crew and orders them to strip the gear off the deck and batten down the hatches.
And the crew actually laughed at him.
Of course they did. They looked around and saw blue sky, gentle waves. They're asking, are we taking the sails down too? They're mocking him.
And the captain, completely stone-faced, says, "You better do." He orders the storm sail, the heavy canvas, to be put up. The crew thinks he's lost his mind.
But he hadn't.
Not at all. At 9 p.m., the hammer dropped. Fred Krauss described it in this wonderful dialect. He said the storm came same as you emptied it out of a bag.
1 minute calm, the next minute total chaos.
The violence of that transition is hard to imagine for us today. We usually get a severe thunderstorm watch hours in advance.
Krauss mentions a detail that really shows the power involved. There was a 2-inch thick spruce plank on the deck.
Nailed down with 5-inch spikes.
The wind didn't just loosen it. It ripped it straight off the boat and hurled it into the Atlantic like a toothpick. It sheared off the topmasts.
If they hadn't listened to that captain's gut feeling.
The Partana would have been driftwood.
And that's the point de Villiers is making about the old ways. Before we decoded the physics, the wind felt like an arbitrary, angry god. If you didn't know why the pressure was dropping, if you couldn't see the isobar lines on a map, then the storm felt like a judgment.
It felt like you were being targeted personally.
Right.
Why me? Why my boat?
Exactly.
Today, we know the why, or at least we know the how. But as we move into our next segment, I want to argue that knowing the science doesn't make it any less magical. In fact, seeing how these systems connect across the globe makes it even more awe-inspiring.
This is the perfect segue to the story of Hurricane Ivan.
A true monster storm.
A historic monster.
Yeah.
But the book doesn't start the story of Ivan in the Caribbean, where it destroyed homes. It doesn't start it in the Atlantic. To find the birth of Ivan, you have to travel to the spring of 2004. You have to go to the Sahel, the southern fringe of the Sahara Desert, places like Darfur.
And what's fascinating is that the seed of this disaster wasn't something bad. It was something good.
It was wonderful news. It rained. In Darfur, which had been suffering from terrible drought and civil war, the skies finally opened up.
In Timbuktu, the ground turned green.
Lake Chad, which is perpetually shrinking, actually stopped shrinking for a season. For the people living there, this was a blessing. The desert was blooming.
So we have green shoots in Timbuktu. It sounds like a happy ending, but you need to explain to me how a green desert leads to a catastrophe in Florida.
It's all about the global heat engine. You have to look at the geography. Deep in the Sahara, there is a place called the Tibesti Mesef.
Sounds imposing.
It is. It's a rupture in the earth, a rugged volcanic mountain range right in the middle of a desert. The highest peak, Emikusi, is over 11,000 feet high. Now think about the physics there. You have dark volcanic rock in the middle of a blazing desert.
It's going to get hot, like frying an egg on the sidewalk
And
high.
hotter. And hot air rises. So you have this superheated air rushing up the sides of these mountains. In meteorology, we call that anabatic flow. It's racing uphill like a freight train.
Right.
But at the same time, high up in the atmosphere, you have cooler air trying to sink. That's the katabatic flow.
So you have an upward rushing stream of hot air smashing into a downward rushing stream of cool air. It's a head-on collision.
Exactly. And that collision creates turbulence. It creates rotation. It generates massive thunderheads and these little spinning vortices of energy. These are the pulses. And because of the trade winds, these pulses don't stay in the Tibesti Mountains. They drift west.
They drift over Mali, over Niger.
Right over those green fields in Timbuktu. And this is the crucial link.
Because the ground was wet.
Because the ground was wet and green from the rains we mentioned, those pulses didn't fizzle out. Usually the dry desert air sucks the moisture out of storms and kills them. But this time, the blessing of the rain fed the monster. The moisture kept the pulses alive.
So the good news in Timbuktu kept the bad news alive for America.
The pulse crosses the African coast and hits the Atlantic Ocean. And this is the moment of transformation. De Villiers writes that this is where air becomes wind.
The pulse hits the warm ocean water. It organizes itself. It starts to spin faster.
It feeds on the heat of the sea, and that little packet of turbulence from a mountain in Chad becomes Hurricane Ivan.
And Ivan was utterly devastating.
It was a catastrophe, but think about the chain of causality. A rural tavern in Pennsylvania gets flooded. A condo in Gulf Shores gets ripped apart. Why? Because the drought ended in Sudan.
It's staggering. We always hear about the butterfly effect. You know, butterfly flaps its wings in Brazil and causes a tornado in Texas. And sounds like a poetic metaphor.
Yeah.
But this is literal.
It is the ultimate lesson in interconnectedness. We share one atmosphere. There are no borders up there. We are all breathing the same recycled, spinning air mass. A change in humidity in the Sahara eventually knocks on your door in Alabama.
It's no wonder, then, that for most of human history, before we understood adiabatic flows and ocean currents, we looked at this force and saw gods.
If you can't see the physics, you have to invent a story.
We had to. The human mind craves explanation. If something is powerful, invisible, and can kill you without warning, the default explanation is deity.
The book catalogs some amazing myths.
I really like the creation myths where wind isn't just a force, but the actual spark of life.
It's a very common theme across cultures. Take the Dogon people of Mali. They have an incredibly complex cosmology. They believe that in the beginning, there were founding couples created to populate the Earth, but they ran into a biological problem immediately.
Incest.
Right. You can't build a healthy population from a single set of parents. So the myth offers a solution. The story says the women's mouths opened and wind came out.
That wind was the breath of life.
Yes. It mixed with their biology to create new, genetically distinct life, bypassing the bottleneck. It links wind directly to the concept of the soul, or the breath.
Which makes sense linguistically, too. In many languages, the word for spirit and breath or wind is the exact same. Spiritus in Latin, ruach in Hebrew.
Exactly. Then you look at the Micmac people on the Atlantic coast. They have a hero figure named Glooskap.
I remember this one. He battles the wind.
Well, he tries to manage it. The story goes that the wind was blowing so hard that the world was uninhabitable. You couldn't fish, you couldn't hunt. So Glooskap goes looking for the source. He finds a giant eagle whose wings are creating the gale.
And he captures the eagle.
He ties its wings shut.
Problem solved. No more wind.
But then he realizes the unintended consequences. Without wind, the air became completely stagnant. The water in the bays became still and slimy. The fish died. The world became uninhabitable in a totally different way.
It turned into a swamp.
So Glooskap has to go back and untie one of the eagle's wings. It's a very sophisticated ecological parable. It acknowledges that even though the wind is annoying or dangerous, it is strictly necessary for a healthy system. It scrubs the world clean.
I also love the Sand people of the Kalahari. They believe the wind carries stories.
Not just legends, but gossip. The wind carries the news. And if you think about it biologically, scents, pheromones, sounds carrying on the breeze, that is literally true.
If a predator is coming, the wind tells the prey.
If water is nearby, the wind tells the thirsty.
There's also the Bozo people of the Sahara. They have a wrestling match myth.
Wind versus water, a primordial wrestling match, water lost. And the myth says that is why the desert exists. The wind dried up the water. It's a geological truth wrapped in a wrestling story.
Now, all these myths are attempts to understand the wind, but we also have this deep need to map it, to put boundaries on it, the four corners of the earth.
This is a universal human obsession. We want to square the circle. The horizon is a circle, clearly. If you stand in the ocean, it's 360 degrees. But we insist on dividing it. Front, back, left, right, north, south, east, west.
You see this in the Bible, don't you?
You do. In the book of Revelation, there's a specific scene with 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds. It reinforces this idea of a square, manageable earth. And de Villiers points out something hilarious. Even modern flat earthers have tried to map these corners.
I didn't know there was a consensus on where the corners were. I thought the flat earth was a disk.
It gets complicated. According to some fringe theories, there are 5 corners.
5 corners on a square.
Don't ask me to explain the geometry.
Yeah.
But they include Fogo Island in Newfoundland, which is a beautiful windswept place, and somewhere in Tasmania. It just shows how desperate we are to pin this thing down. We want coordinates for the chaos.
But the Greeks didn't just map them. They gave them personalities.
The Anemoi, the sons of Eos, the dawn. This is where we get our poetic names for the wind. You had Boreas, the north wind.
How was he depicted?
As a stallion.
Which is perfect. He was wild, strong, cold. The myth says he fathered horses that were so light on their feet they could run over a field of standing corn without bending the stalks.
It is such a beautiful image. It captures that feeling of a fast, biting wind that doesn't have the heavy oppression of a storm, just cutting right over the top of the crops.
Then you had Zephyrus, the west wind. Now, this is interesting because his personality changed over time.
How so?
In the early myths, he was savage, violent. But as the centuries passed, the Greeks softened him. He became the gentle wind of spring that brings the flowers. It shows that our relationship with the wind evolves. It's not static.
Okay, we've worshipped the wind, we've mapped it. But here is where it gets really interesting for me. We tried to do business with it. The economy of wind. The concept of buying wind. It sounds absurd to us today. We can't Venmo Mother Nature. But put yourself in the shoes of a sailor in 1600. You are becalmed. You are floating in a wooden tub in the middle of nowhere.
Your water is running out.
Scurvy is setting in. You aren't moving an inch.
In that context, wind is the most valuable commodity on Earth.
It was life itself. So naturally, a market emerged. De Villiers talks about the Finnish wizards. They were famous for this.
The knotted rope.
Exactly. If you were captain, you would go to a wizard before a voyage and buy a rope with 3 knots in it. It was a tiered system, like a subscription service for propulsion.
Walk me through the tiers.
You untie the first knot, and you get a gentle breeze, just enough to get you out of the harbor. You untie the second knot, and you get a stiff, steady wind. Good for crossing open ocean.
And the third knot.
The third knot was the nuclear option. It released a gale, and the strict rule was you never, ever untie the third knot unless you are safely in port and your enemy is at sea.
It was a weapon. It wasn't just Finland, though. This was a global trade. Sir Walter Scott, the famous writer, claimed he actually met a woman in Scotland who sold wind.
In the Orkney Islands, she was a wind seller. She would boil her kettle and mutter incantations to conjure up a gale for a price. She sold winds for 6p. It was a cottage industry. Get your fresh breeze here, 6p a pop.
And there's a great American story about this, too. Captain Paris Kaler.
A classic New England tale. Kaler was known as a notorious blasphemer. A tough, cynical guy. He's stuck at sea, becalmed. He gets completely frustrated. He reaches into his pocket, pulls out a quarter, and throws it overboard into the dead, calm water.
He's paying the toll.
He yells out, "I want a quarter's worth of wind."
Did he get his money's worth?
Oh, he got it. A hurricane hit the ship almost instantly. It blew the sails right off the masts. It took him days to limp back onto course. And his review of the transaction was classic. He said, "If I knew it was as cheap as that, I wouldn't have bought half as much."
I love that. It captures that feeling that even when we try to transact with nature, we are wildly out of our depth. We ask for a breeze, we get a disaster.
And that leads us perfectly into the idea of named winds. We don't name rain. We don't say, "Oh, here comes Kevin, the drizzle." But we name winds, the Mistral, the Chinook, the Sirocco.
We name them because they have personalities,
Yeah.
and usually those personalities are nasty.
Exactly. We name things we fear or things we need to respect. Let's talk about the desert winds again. The harmattan.
In the Mediterranean, they call it the Sirocco, but in the deep Sahara, it's the harmattan, the breath of death.
De Villiers brings up a character from the novel Beau Geste Raoul. Raoul isn't a person. Raoul is the drummer of death. That is the personification of the harmattan. It's not just wind, it is a physical assault. It picks up millions of tons of dust from the Sahara and carries it north.
The book mentions that this dust ends up in the most unlikely places.
It coats cars in London. It turns the swimming pools of the super rich in the Côte d'Azur into gritty milk. But physically, it's devastating to the human body. It drops the humidity from 80% to 10% in a matter of hours.
It sucks the moisture right out of you.
Your skin cracks, your nose bleeds, you become highly irritable. It's physiologically draining. It's like being mummified while you're still alive.
And then there is the Ghibli. This is a Libyan wind.
The Ghibli has a very specific, very strange myth attached to it. The camel masters say that if the Ghibli blows for 40 days straight, the camels become pregnant without a male.
That is highly specific and biologically confusing.
It speaks to the madness the wind induces. The idea is that the natural order breaks down completely. Reality bends. When the wind blows that hard for that long, impossibility becomes possible. The wind is so generative, so forceful, it can create life out of nothing.
And that leads us to the nervous winds, the winds that mess with our heads. The most famous one in North America has to be the Santa Ana in California.
The Santa Ana? Raymond Chandler wrote the definitive description of this. He said it's a wind that makes meek little wives feel the edge of the carving knife and steady their husband's neck.
That is such a dark, evocative line. It implies violence bubbling just under the surface.
But it's based on physiology. The Santa Ana is a katabatic wind. It flows downhill from the high desert, compressing and heating up. It is hot, dry, and highly charged with static electricity. It increases the positive ion count in the air.
And that affects us.
It seems to. It makes your skin itch, it makes your nerves jump, it triggers migraines, it puts your body into a state of low-level fight or flight.
Is there actual science to this? Or is it just folklore?
It's moving from folklore to science. It goes back to Hippocrates, the father of medicine. He wrote a treatise called Airs, Waters, and Places. He believed south winds caused flabby bodies and dysentery, while north winds caused coughs. He was the first biometeorologist.
And today?
Today, in countries like Germany, the weather forecast actually includes a bioweather report.
You're kidding, like cloudy with a chance of a bad mood.
Seriously. The weatherman will say, tomorrow will be cloudy with a chance of migraines or phantom pain in amputated limbs. There is statistically significant data showing that certain winds affect blood pressure, mood, and pain levels. We are biological barometers. When the pressure drops, our bodies react.
The most tragic example of wind affecting the mind has to be the Dust Bowl, the Dirty 30s.
The Black Blizzard. This wasn't just a storm. It was a decade of relentless wind. It buried fences. It buried houses. It buried hope.
There is a story in the book about a Saskatchewan farmer that broke my heart.
It's from the memoir of a farm wife. She describes how the wind never stopped howling. It whistled through the cracks in the walls day and night. It's the sonic torture. Her husband stood it for 2 months, just listening to the whistling, watching his farm blow away.
And then?
One day, he just snapped. He opened the door, screamed, and walked out into the storm.
And never came back.
He let the dust bury him. The wind pushed him past the breaking point. It's a stark reminder that we are psychological creatures, and relentless noise and pressure from the atmosphere can break us.
There's even talk about crime rates.
Yes. There are studies and certainly plenty of anecdotes suggesting rape cases increase during the Chinook winds in the Rockies, or crimes of passion spike in Sicily during the Sirocco. In Wyoming, there was apparently a law from the mid-19th century that accepted wind-induced insanity as a defense for murder.
The wind made me do it!
It sounds like a cheap excuse, but if you've ever stood in a howling gale for hours, you understand the tension, you understand the urge to just scream.
So we've talked about the personality of the wind, the myths, the madness. We've covered the why me aspect. But now I want to pivot to the stage itself, the theater. What is this stuff blowing around us? How did we get an atmosphere that allows us to breathe but also tries to kill us?
This brings us to a really profound shift in perspective, and it starts with a question from the author's cousin, Colin.
They were kids again, right?
Yes, diving for rock lobster crayfish in the Indian Ocean. They are sitting on the rocks, drying off, and Colin asks this question. If the crayfish can't see the water, and they look up, do they think the fish are flying?
Whoa. That's trippy.
It's a deep question for a kid. It implies that the crayfish doesn't know it's in water. Water is just the medium of existence. It's invisible to them. And de Villiers realizes we are bottom feeders.
We are bottom feeders?
We live at the bottom of a sea of air. We don't see the air, just like the lobster doesn't see the water. We look up and see clouds flying, but really, they are just floating in the medium. We are crawling around on the substrate of a massive ocean of gas.
So let's look at this medium, this atmosphere. It hasn't always been this way. We tend to think air is air. But de Villiers points out that the air we breathe is actually a relatively new invention.
We are actually on atmosphere number 3.
Walk us through them. This is the history of the world in 3 acts.
Act 1, the Hadean Eon. This is right after the Earth formed, about 4.5 billion years ago. The atmosphere was just cosmic junk, mostly helium and hydrogen left over from the formation of the solar system.
Could we breathe it?
Absolutely not, and we wouldn't want to. The Earth was so hot, literally molten, that most of this atmosphere just boiled off into space. It was too light to be held by gravity and too hot to stay put.
So, Act 2,
Correct.
The Hadean atmosphere boils away. What replaces it?
Act 2 starts when the Earth begins to cool, the crust forms, but underneath it's still raging. Volcanoes are erupting everywhere. They are outgassing tons of material, water vapor, carbon dioxide, ammonia, methane.
This sounds totally toxic.
To us, yes. It would kill us instantly. But this is where water appears. And de Villiers calls water an alien molecule.
Why alien?
Because it likely came from space. The theory is that comets, basically frozen dirty snowballs the size of mountains, smashed into the early Earth. They delivered the water. And water is weird chemically. It's one of the few substances where the solid form ice floats on the liquid form.
Which is lucky for us.
It's essential. If ice sank, our oceans would freeze from the bottom up. They would become solid blocks of ice, and life might never have evolved. So we have a toxic volcanic atmosphere with some comet water.
How do we get to Act 3? the one we can actually breathe.
That is the great transformation. About 3.5 billion years ago, a tiny miracle happened. Photosynthetic bacteria appeared. The blue-green algae.
These are the heroes of this story.
They are, and this is the great fluke of our existence. There were other bacteria around, sulfur-eating bacteria. They were fighting for dominance. If the sulfur eaters had won, the atmosphere would be completely different. It would smell like rotten eggs, and we wouldn't be here.
So we are basically the byproduct of a bacterial war that happened billions of years ago.
We are the winner's descendants. These photosynthetic bacteria started doing something new. They took in sunlight and CO2, and they pumped out oxygen. Slowly, over billions of years, oxygen levels rose from trace amounts to the 20% we have today. That is the living atmosphere. It is a biological construction.
It's amazing to think that the air we breathe isn't just there. It was made. It was manufactured by slime.
And it took us a long time to understand that. Aristotle, one of the smartest men in history, got it completely wrong.
The four elements.
Earth, air, fire, water. He thought air was a fundamental element, an indivisible substance. And he added a fifth one, quintessentia, or ether, to explain space. This held science back for centuries because everyone just assumed Aristotle was right.
When did we finally figure it out?
Not until the 1700s. The chemist Lavoisier came along. He realized that air wasn't a single thing. It was a mixture. Nitrogen, oxygen, argon. He proved that combustion wasn't a release of phlogiston, but a reaction with oxygen.
And didn't he literally burn the books?
He did. He staged a ceremonial burning of the old alchemy books to symbolize the break with the past. He paved the way for modern chemistry. He basically said, stop listening to the ancient Greeks and look at the gas in the flask.
So what does this all mean? We've gone from a boy terrified on a beach in Cape Town to the molecular structure of the atmosphere. We've gone from buying a wind with a quarter to tracking hurricanes with satellites.
It brings us back to that sense of awe. Even with all our satellites, even knowing that air is 78% nitrogen and 21% oxygen, we still feel small when the wind blows.
The book mentions storm chasers. The author compares them to religious seekers.
I think that's incredibly accurate. Why do people drive into the path of a tornado? It's not just adrenaline. It's a need to witness what de Villiers calls a grim and capricious dictator. When you see a tornado or a hurricane, you are seeing the raw power of the planet. It reminds us that we are not in control.
Despite our thermostats and our double-pane windows.
Precisely. We can hide from the wind, but we cannot tame it. It shaped our history, it shapes our biology, and it will probably shape our future.
I want to leave you, our listeners, with a final thought today, going back to that crayfish analogy.
It's a highly provocative one.
If we are just bottom feeders in a sea of air, unaware of the surface far above us, what else are we missing?
Right. The crayfish doesn't know about the world above the water. It doesn't know about birds or humans or stars. It is entirely limited by its medium.
So are we, like the lobster, oblivious to the true nature of our environment? What is floating above our atmosphere? What dimensions or forces exist just beyond the edge of our sea that we can't even conceive of because we are trapped in our own medium?
That is a question that will keep you up at night when the wind is howling outside your window.
It certainly will.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the invisible force that shapes our world.
Keep your eyes on the horizon.
And we'll see you next time.